Dear students, today we shall discuss another important and repeatedly examined question of CSS and PMS Islamiat. The question is enumerate the articles of faith in Islam and state their effects on practical life of a Muslim. At first glance, this question looks almost identical to the previous ones. However, if you read it carefully, you will discover that the examiner has subtly changed the focus. Previously, the examiner concentrated on belief in the hereafter and its impact. Today, the examiner wants something broader. He asks us to explain the practical effects of all the articles of faith on the life of a Muslim. Therefore, your answer should not spend pages explaining the definition of every article. Instead, briefly enumerate the six articles of faith and devote the major portion of your answer to explaining how these beliefs influence the everyday life of a Muslim. Remember one important examination principle: Islamic beliefs are never meant to remain theoretical, they are intended to transform human life. That is exactly what the examiner wants you to demonstrate. So before writing, always identify the command words. The examiner says enumerate. This means briefly list the articles of faith. He does not ask you to explain each article in detail. Then he asks, state their effects on the practical life of a Muslim. This is the real focus. Therefore, allocate your answer approximately like this. The part 1 should be 20-25%, and that part 1 is brief enumeration of the six articles of faith. Part 2, which is 75-80%, is practical effects of these beliefs on the everyday life of a Muslim. This balanced approach demonstrates that you have understood the demand of the question. So, students, one of the distinguishing characteristics of Islam is that it does not separate belief from action. In Islam, faith is not merely an intellectual conviction, nor is it confined to personal spirituality. Rather, faith becomes meaningful only when it manifests itself in practical conduct. The Quran repeatedly combines Iman with Amal Saleh, faith with righteous deeds. This inseparable relationship demonstrates that genuine belief inevitably transforms human behavior. Allah Almighty says, indeed, those who believe and perform righteous deeds shall have gardens beneath which rivers flow. So, this is repeated throughout the Quran. Thus, Islamic beliefs are not abstract doctrines, they are practical principles that shape every dimension of human life. Before discussing their practical effects, let's briefly enumerate the six articles of faith. A Muslim believes in Allah, His angels, His divine books, His messengers, the last day, divine decree. These six beliefs together constitute the ideological foundation of Islam. However, their real significance lies in their practical implementation. So, students, this is an important analytical point that which is why do Islamic beliefs produce practical results? Islam does not recognize a distinction between belief and conduct. Correct beliefs naturally produced correct actions, just as healthy roots produce healthy fruits. Sound faith produces righteous character. Therefore, the practical life of a Muslim is nothing more than the visible expression of his inner beliefs. The stronger the faith, the stronger the character. Now we'll discuss the practical effects of the articles of faith. This is the real heart of the question. Instead of discussing every article separately, explain how all six beliefs collectively transform practical life. First, they establish complete obedience to Allah. Belief in Allah makes a Muslim recognize only one ultimate authority. Consequently, all aspects of life, personal, social, economic, political, and moral, are conducted according to divine guidance rather than personal desires. The believer asks what pleases Allah before making decisions. Second, they develop a strong moral accountability. Belief in angels who continuously record every action together with belief in the hereafter creates an ever present sense of responsibility. The believer avoids wrongdoing even in complete privacy because he knows that Allah's knowledge is absolute and every deed is recorded. Thus, honesty becomes a permanent habit rather than occasional behavior. Third, they encourage adherence to divine guidance. Belief in the divine books convinces Muslims that true guidance comes from Allah. Consequently, the Quran becomes the primary source of moral values, family ethics, social conduct, economic dealings, and legal principles. A Muslim therefore seeks guidance from revelation rather than changing human preferences. Fourth, they inspire the practical example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Belief in the messengers means more than accepting their historical existence. It requires following their teachings. For Muslims, the life of Muhammad, peace be upon him, becomes the ideal model for worship, leadership, justice, family relations, business ethics, education, and social interaction. Thus, faith produces practical emulation. Fifth, they strengthen honesty and integrity. Belief in the hereafter constantly reminds believers that every action carries eternal consequences. As a result, Muslims are encouraged to avoid lying, cheating, fraud, corruption, bribery, deception, and exploitation. Integrity becomes an act of faith rather than merely a social expectation. Sixth, they cultivate patience and perseverance. Belief in divine decree teaches Muslims that every event occurs within Allah's perfect knowledge and wisdom. This belief protects them from despair during hardship and arrogance during prosperity. Instead, they combine hard work, prayer, patience, and trust in Allah. Seventh, they promote self discipline. Islamic beliefs regulate every aspect of life. The believer controls speech, anger, desires, wealth, time, and relationships, knowing that every action has spiritual consequences. Thus, faith becomes a source of personal discipline. Eighth, they develop social responsibility. Believers understand that they are accountable not only for personal worship but also for fulfilling the rights of others. Consequently, they care for parents, family, neighbors, orphans, the poor, travelers, and society at large. So, faith therefore produces active citizenship. Ninth, they encourage justice and fairness. A Muslim recognizes that every injustice committed against another person will be judged by Allah. Therefore, he strives to remain just in business, education, employment, family matters, and public office. Justice becomes a religious obligation rather than merely a legal requirement. 10th, they create psychological balance. Modern life is characterized by anxiety, material competition, loneliness, and uncertainty. Islamic beliefs provide hope during suffering, gratitude during success, contentment in adversity, and confidence in Allah's wisdom. Thus, faith contributes to emotional well being. 11th, they inspire excellence, that is, ihsan. A believer performs every task sincerely, whether studying, teaching, trading, serving society, or governing, because he realizes that Allah observes every action. Consequently, faith encourages excellence rather than mediocrity. 12th, they prepare Muslims for success in both worlds. Islam rejects the false distinction between worldly success and spiritual success. The practical implementation of faith enables believers to achieve personal fulfillment, social respect, ethical excellence, and eternal salvation. Thus, Islam creates balanced personalities capable of contributing positively to both this world and the hereafter. So, dear students, this is where your answer becomes analytical to connect these effects with the uh, contemporary world. Today, many societies possess advanced technology, powerful institutions, and comprehensive legal systems. Yet they continue to struggle with corruption, crime, family disintegration, mental stress, consumerism, dishonesty, and declining ethical standards. The underlying problem is not merely the absence of laws, but the absence of inner moral conviction. Islam addresses this challenge by producing morally responsible individuals whose behavior is guided not merely by external surveillance but by internal faith. Consequently, Islamic beliefs function as the most effective mechanism for ethical self regulation and responsible citizenship. So, there should be integration of the articles of faith. So always demonstrate how these articles operate together. Belief in Allah determines the purpose of life. Belief in angels creates continuous accountability. Belief in divine books provides guidance. Belief in prophets offers practical models. Belief in the hereafter motivates righteous action. Belief in divine decree develops resilience and trust. Together, they transform faith into action, character into conduct, and individuals into morally responsible members of society. So, never conclude by simply repeating the simple six articles of faith. Instead, conclude analytically, like the articles of faith constitute the ideological foundation of Islam, but their true significance lies in their practical manifestation. They transform belief into action, worship into character, and spirituality into social responsibility. By cultivating obedience to Allah, honesty, accountability, justice, patience, compassion, self discipline, ethical excellence, these beliefs shape the practical life of a Muslim in every aspect of life. Consequently, the articles of faith are not merely theological doctrines to be professed, but dynamic principles that guide personal conduct, strengthen social institutions, and establish a balanced, moral, and progressive civilization. Dear students, whenever this question appears, recognize the command word enumerate and briefly list the six articles of faith instead of discussing each at length. Reserve the major portion of your answer for explaining their practical effects on the life of a Muslim. Treat the six articles as an integrated system showing how they collectively shape belief, behavior, and decision making. Support your analysis with relevant Quranic verses and authentic hadiths, especially those linking faith with righteous action. Organize the discussion under practical themes such as obedience to Allah, accountability, integrity, justice, patience, self discipline, social responsibility, and psychological balance, rather than merely repeating the effects of each article separately. Relate the discussion to contemporary challenges including corruption, ethical decline, consumerism, family crisis, and mental stress to demonstrate analytical maturity. Conclude by emphasizing that Islam measures the strength of faith not by verbal profession but alone, but by its visible impact on on daily life, making the articles of faith the driving force behind a Muslim's personal excellence and constructive role in society. Thank you very much.